Somewhere in a French prison cell in the year 1794, a mathematician was writing about a future he would never see, in a world that was, at that very moment, trying to kill him. He was not imagining flying machines or distant planets. He was imagining you, a person, centuries later, living longer, healthier, freer than anyone in his own time could quite believe. He finished the manuscript. Then he died, before it was even published. And here's the strange part. He was mostly right. It is late now, wherever you are. The room around you has gone soft at the edges, the way rooms do at this hour. And somewhere beneath the quiet you can probably feel the small, familiar hum of your own devices. A phone on the nightstand, maybe its screen dark but not really off, waiting. 100 years ago, the person lying where you are lying now could not have imagined that hum. 200 years ago, they could not have imagined the room itself, wired invisibly into a web that spans the whole planet. And yet here you are, inside someone else's old idea of the future, falling asleep in it the way we all do, every night without noticing. Tonight is not about what is going to happen. It's about something quieter and, in its way, stranger. The long human habit of trying to see forward in time. Not prophecy exactly, though it starts there. Something closer to a very old form of hope, dressed up, again and again, in the language of its own era. Let's go back. Not into the future, into the history of the future, into the long procession of people who stood at the edge of what they knew and tried to describe what they couldn't. The story doesn't begin with science. It begins with something much older and much stranger, with a woman sitting on a tripod above a crack in the earth, breathing in fumes that may or may not have been there, in a temple built into the side of a mountain in ancient Greece. This was the oracle at Delphi, and the woman was called the Pythia. For centuries, kings and generals and ordinary citizens climbed that mountain to ask her what was coming. Her answers were famously, deliberately unclear, riddles wrapped in riddles, phrased so that almost anything that later happened could be said to have been predicted. Historians still debate what was actually happening inside that chamber, whether there really were vapors rising from a geological fissure beneath the temple, as some modern geological studies have suggested, or whether the whole apparatus was simply theater, a stage for a very human need. But notice what's really going on here. Underneath the smoke and the riddles, it isn't really about knowing the future. It's about the unbearable discomfort of not knowing it, and the lengths people will go to feel like they do. And Delphi was hardly alone in this instinct. Across the ancient world, nearly every civilization developed its own method for peering forward. In ancient China, the I Ching, or Book of Changes, offered a system of hexagrams that diviners consulted for guidance about what was to come, a tradition stretching back, in some form, well over 2,000 years. The Maya developed intricate calendrical systems, tracking cycles of time with an astonishing mathematical precision, used in part to anticipate agricultural seasons and ceremonial occasions. None of these systems, examined closely, were really about literal prophecy in the way we might imagine it today. They were about structure, about giving an unpredictable world enough shape that a person could feel, if only for a moment, that they were standing on solid ground. That discomfort never really left us. It just kept finding new costumes. In the 16th century, a French apothecary and self-styled seer named Michel de Nostradamus. Nostradamus, as history remembers him, published a book of nearly 1,000 short cryptic quatrains called Les Prophéties in 1555. Like the Pythia's riddles, they were vague enough to be reinterpreted endlessly, bent and rebent, to fit whatever crisis was currently frightening whoever was reading them. And think about what that tells us. The vagueness wasn't a flaw in these predictions. It was the entire mechanism. A prophecy that's too specific can be proven wrong. A prophecy that's beautifully, hauntingly vague can be proven right forever by anyone about almost anything. But somewhere in the centuries between Delphi and Nostradamus, and especially after him, something began to shift. People started to ask a different question. Not, what will the gods reveal to us about tomorrow? But what can we, ourselves, reason our way toward? This is where the story really begins to gather speed. With the Enlightenment, that great, restless flowering of European thought in the 1700s, when philosophers began to trust something new. The idea that human reason itself, applied patiently and carefully, might actually be able to chart where things were heading, not through visions, through evidence. And here is where we meet that mathematician again, the one in the prison cell. His name was Nicolas de Condorcet. He had been, for most of his life, one of the great minds of the French Enlightenment, a mathematician, a philosopher, an early and passionate advocate for the abolition of slavery and for the rights of women decades before either cause found wide support. He had helped shape the ideals of the French Revolution itself. But revolutions, as history keeps teaching us, have a habit of devouring even their own architects. By 1793, Condorcet had fallen out of favor with the increasingly violent turn the revolution had taken, and he was forced into hiding, moving between safe houses in Paris, sheltered by friends who risked their own lives to protect him. It was during this hiding, in fear, in isolation, likely knowing that his own death might not be far away, that Condorcet wrote his last and most extraordinary work, a book called Sketch for a Historical Picture of the Progress of the Human Mind. Think about that for a moment. A man in hiding from a mob that wanted him dead, sitting down to write about how human civilization was, on the whole, moving upward, toward more knowledge, more equality, more freedom, longer and healthier lives. He was eventually captured in March of 1794 and died in prison under circumstances that remain somewhat unclear, possibly from illness, possibly by his own hand. Historians are not entirely certain. His book was published after his death in 1795, and in it, astonishingly, he predicted, carefully, cautiously, using the qualifying language of a scientist rather than a prophet, that human lifespans would keep extending, that education would spread more widely, that the vast inequalities between nations and between men and women would gradually narrow. He was not always right. Progress, as the 20th century would prove, in the most brutal ways imaginable, is not a straight line. But the core of what Condorcet was doing was genuinely new. He wasn't reading omens. He was extrapolating, taking the visible trends of his own moment and following them forward with disciplined imagination. This is, in a very real sense, the birth of modern futurism, not mysticism, but method. It's worth sitting with the strangeness of that image a little longer because it really is remarkable. Here was a man who had spent his career advocating calmly, rationally, for the expansion of human rights, now hunted by the very revolution those ideas had helped inspire. And instead of despairing, he used his final months to write what amounts to a careful, hopeful argument for why the long arc of history bends toward improvement. He wrote of 10 distinct historical epochs, moving from the earliest human societies up through his own age, and then dared to sketch a 10th future epoch he would never witness, one of expanding equality, better medicine, and wider education. Historians still discuss how much of what followed genuinely traces back to Condorcet's specific influence and how much simply reflected currents of thought already moving through European intellectual life at the time. But his method, patient, evidence-based extrapolation, offered with humility rather than certainty, set a template that thinkers about the future would return to again and again. That method needed fuel, though, and the fuel arrived soon after, in the form of something loud and iron and impossible to ignore. The steam engine, the railway, the telegraph. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how people worked. It changed how fast change itself seemed to be arriving. A person born in 1780 could live to see steamships and railways that would have seemed like magic to their own grandparents. And once people started to feel the speed of change in their own lifetimes, imagining the future stopped being a purely philosophical exercise. It became, almost overnight, entertainment. Before we meet the two men who would come to define this new genre most vividly, it's worth pausing on one earlier book that, in its own quiet way, prepared the ground for them. In 1888, an American writer named Edward Bellamy published a novel called Looking Backward, in which its narrator falls into a deep, hypnotic sleep in Boston in the 1880s and wakes, astonishingly, in the year 2000, in a transformed society organized around cooperation rather than competition, with material want largely eliminated. The book became one of the best-selling American novels of its century, and its popularity was so intense that readers across the country began forming what were called Bellamy clubs, gathering to discuss how the ideas in the novel might actually be brought into being. It's a small, telling detail worth sitting with, a work of pure imagination about a future none of its readers would live to see, spawning real clubs, real conversations, real people trying, in their own limited way, to build toward it. The future, once imagined vividly enough, has always had this peculiar power to reach backward and change the present that dreamed it up. This is where two men enter the story who, more than almost anyone else, invented the modern idea of the future as a place you could visit in your imagination, a genre unto itself. The first was a Frenchman named Jules Verne, born in 1828 in the port city of Nantes, the son of a lawyer who expected his son to follow him into the profession. Verne did train briefly as a lawyer, and even worked for a time as a stockbroker in Paris, a job he apparently found tedious beyond words. What he really loved obsessively was the sea and travel, and the astonishing pace of scientific discovery happening all around him. In 1863, he published 5 Weeks in a Balloon, and it was such an unexpected success that his publisher, a shrewd man named Pierre-Jules Hetzel, signed him to write book after book, what became known as the Voyages Extraordinaires. Over the following decades, Verne gave the world Journey to the Center of the Earth, From the Earth to the Moon, And in 1870, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, with its extraordinary submarine, the Nautilus, and its brooding captain, Nemo. What made Verne different from Nostradamus, different from the Pythia, was that he grounded his imagination in real engineering, real science, real numbers, even when the destination was fantastical. His moon launching cannon in From the Earth to the Moon was fired from Florida, a detail that, a century later, when NASA chose Florida as the launch site for the actual Apollo missions, would strike readers as an almost eerie coincidence, though, of course, it had more to do with practical geography than prophecy. Verne himself was reportedly skeptical, later in life, that heavier-than-air flight or actual space travel would happen the way some of his contemporaries imagined. He was not infallible. He was something more interesting than infallible. He was a man carefully, joyfully extending the edges of what was scientifically plausible and inviting his readers to stand at that edge with him. The second man was English, born in 1866 in Bromley, just outside London, into a family with very little money. His father a shopkeeper and one-time professional cricketer, his mother a former lady's maid. His name was Herbert George Wells, and unlike Verne, whose optimism about science was fairly steady, Wells's relationship with the future was far more anxious, far more morally complicated. As a young man, Wells won a scholarship to study biology at the Normal School of Science in London, where he was taught remarkably by Thomas Henry Huxley, the biologist so fiercely devoted to defending Charles Darwin's theory of evolution that he was nicknamed Darwin's Bulldog. That education never left Wells. It shaped everything he wrote. In 1895, Wells published The Time Machine, introducing to the world one of its most enduring images, a nameless inventor building a machine to travel through time itself. Arriving eventually in the year 800 and 2701, where humanity has split into two distinct species, the gentle, childlike Eloi living above ground, and the pale, subterranean Morlocks, who, it is slowly and horribly revealed, farm and eat them. This was not an optimist's future. It was evolutionary theory taken to its darkest possible conclusion, a warning wrapped in a story about what might happen if the divide between the comfortable and the laboring classes of Victorian England were allowed to widen generation after generation for hundreds of thousands of years. 3 years later, in 1898, Wells published The War of the Worlds, imagining a Martian invasion of England with a chilling, matter-of-fact brutality that still unsettles readers today. Decades later, in 1938, a radio adaptation of the novel, produced and narrated by a young Orson Welles for the program The Mercury Theater on the Air, was broadcast in a format styled as a series of live news bulletins. Popular legend has long held that this broadcast caused mass, nationwide panic across America, with listeners fleeing their homes in terror, believing an actual Martian invasion was underway. Modern historians have found that the scale of this panic was significantly exaggerated at the time, largely by newspapers, eager to discredit the still new medium of radio as a source of news. Though, there is good evidence that some listeners were genuinely, if locally, frightened. Either way, it's a remarkable echo across the decades. A story about the future told well enough to make people, however briefly, mistake it for the present. Here's where it gets interesting, though. Wells didn't just write novels. In 1901, he wrote a nonfiction book called Anticipations, in which he tried, quite seriously, to forecast the 20th century and made a series of predictions that ranged from remarkably prescient to entirely wrong, sometimes within the same paragraph. He foresaw something like suburban sprawl enabled by new transportation. He foresaw a kind of European political union. He also, more darkly, anticipated the scale of industrialized warfare that would soon devastate Europe. Wells understood something that Verne, with his cheerful confidence in engineering, hadn't fully grappled with: that new powers, in human hands, could be turned toward destruction just as easily as toward wonder. That tension between marvel and dread would define almost every serious attempt to imagine the future from that point forward. And it wasn't just novelists doing the imagining anymore. As the 20th century opened, ordinary newspapers and magazines began publishing earnest, detailed predictions for their own readers. One of the most famous examples appeared in December of 1900 in Ladies' Home Journal, an American magazine, in an article written by a civil engineer named John Elfrith Watkins, Jr., titled "What May Happen in the Next 100 Years." Watkins predicted that Americans would one day see moving pictures transmitted across oceans in real time, an uncanny anticipation of television and video calling. He predicted that photographs would be sent by telegraph, transmitted across the world within minutes, which, in a broad sense, describes exactly what digital photography and the internet would eventually make effortless. He was wrong about plenty too. He imagined, for instance, that mosquitoes and houseflies would be entirely exterminated, and that letters C, X, and Q would be dropped from the English alphabet for the sake of efficiency. But notice the shape of what he got right and what he got wrong. He was excellent at extending existing trends in communication and transportation. He was far worse at predicting how stubbornly human culture and language would resist tidy, rational reform. The future, it turns out, is easier to predict in wires and engines than in habits and hearts. This blend of genuine engineering, foresight, and pure showmanship reached one of its most magnificent expressions at the New York World's Fair of 1939, whose theme, emblazoned everywhere across its grounds, was "The World of Tomorrow." Visitors walked beneath two enormous structures, a tall spire called the Trilon, and a great white sphere called the Perisphere. And inside the General Motors Pavilion, they queued for hours to experience an exhibit called Futurama, designed by the industrial designer Norman Bell Geddes. Futurama placed visitors in moving chairs above a vast, miniature landscape, a scale model imagining the American city and countryside of 1960, complete with sweeping multi-lane highways, towering skyscrapers spaced apart by green parks, and small model cars moving along automated roads. Millions of people attended that fair, many of them in the depths of the lingering aftershocks of the Great Depression. And here's the striking thing: much of what Futurama imagined actually did come to pass. America built its interstate highway system in the 1950s, in no small part shaped by the same broad cultural appetite for a car-centered suburban future that Belgedez had put on display in miniature in 1939. It's worth pausing on that. This wasn't just a prediction. In a very real sense, it was closer to a blueprint. an imagined future so vivid and appealing that people afterward quietly built their way toward it. It wasn't even the first American World's Fair to try this. 6 years earlier, in 1933, Chicago had hosted its own exposition called A Century of Progress, marking the city's 100th anniversary and celebrating, with a similar mixture of showmanship and genuine engineering ambition, the scientific and industrial advances of the preceding century. Where Chicago's fair looked backward even as it gestured forward, celebrating a century already lived, New York's fair in 1939 made the far bolder choice to name the future outright as its subject and to try to make visitors feel physically as if they had already arrived there. The slogan printed on tickets and souvenirs captured the mood precisely. Visitors were told they were seeing the world of tomorrow, not simply hearing about it. But the World's Fair opened in April of 1939, and by September of that same year, Germany had invaded Poland, and the world tilted into 6 years of the most devastating war in human history. It's a strange, almost unbearable detail of this story that the shining, hopeful vision of tomorrow and the beginning of one of history's darkest chapters arrived within months of each other in the very same year. The future, once again, revealed its two faces at once, and it was the aftermath of that war, its terrible new weapons, its terrible new alliances, that pushed the whole business of imagining the future into an entirely new gear. In 1948, in Santa Monica, California, the United States Air Force helped establish a research organization called RAND, short, somewhat dryly, for Research and Development. RAND's original purpose was to think, in cold and rigorous detail, about the strategic possibilities of the nuclear age, how wars might now be fought, how they might be deterred, how civilization might survive them, or fail to. One of Rand's most influential and unsettling thinkers was Herman Kahn, a physicist by training, who, in 1960, published a book called On Thermonuclear War. Kahn did something that deeply disturbed many of his contemporaries. He insisted on thinking through, in careful, methodical, almost clinical detail, exactly what a nuclear war would actually look like, how many millions might die, and whether civilization could, in fact, be rebuilt afterward. Many people found this kind of thinking morally repellent. The satirist and filmmaker Stanley Kubrick is widely believed to have drawn on Kahn's ideas, and even, in some accounts, on his personal manner when creating the title character of his 1964 film, Dr. Strangelove. But Kahn's underlying method, however chilling its subject, represented something genuinely new in the history of imagining the future: the deliberate construction of multiple detailed scenarios, rather than a single confident prediction. Instead of asking what will happen, this new discipline of futures thinking began asking, what are the several different things that could happen? And how would we recognize early which one we were heading toward? Kahn himself was, by most accounts, a strange and formidable figure, a man of enormous physical size and even more enormous appetite for detail, capable of holding forth for hours on the precise logistics of post-war reconstruction, on shelter design, on casualty projections, all delivered with a kind of unnerving cheerfulness that many listeners found deeply unsettling, precisely because the subject matter was so grim. He was, by his own account and by the accounts of colleagues, trying to do something he considered morally necessary rather than morally repellent, to think clearly about the worst possibility precisely so that they might be better prevented or survived rather than looking away from them out of squeamishness. Whether or not one agrees with that reasoning, it captures something true about this entire history, that imagining the future done seriously has never been a purely comforting exercise. Sometimes the whole point of looking forward is to see something frightening early enough to still be able to change it. At that same institution, two Rand researchers, Olaf Helmer and Norman Dalkey, developed in the 1950s and 60s a formal technique for gathering predictions that came to be called the Delphi method. Its name, a deliberate, knowing echo of that ancient oracle in Greece, though its actual mechanism could not have been more different. Rather than one mysterious priestess muttering riddles, the Delphi method gathered the independent, anonymous judgments of many different experts in multiple rounds, refining a shared forecast through structured feedback rather than mystical insight. It is, when you think about it, the precise mirror image of the ancient method, swapping a single inspired voice for the aggregated, careful reasoning of many. The impulse hadn't changed in nearly 3,000 years. Only the machinery had. This new, more organized approach to thinking about the future soon spread beyond Rand's walls entirely. In 1966, an American sociologist and futurist named Edward Cornish helped found the World Future Society, a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. Created to bring together the growing community of professionals and enthusiasts interested in studying and discussing possible futures. Evidence that, by the middle of the 20th century, thinking seriously about tomorrow had become something close to an actual profession, with its own conferences, its own journals, its own methods to be debated and refined. It's a small but telling milestone. What had once been the domain of oracles and mathematicians hiding from mobs had become, by the 1960s, an entire field with dues-paying members and scholarly publications all wrestling with the same ancient question in thoroughly modern language. Meanwhile, in the world of fiction, a golden age of science fiction was blooming in America, driven substantially by the editor John W. Campbell at the magazine Astounding Science Fiction, who pushed writers to ground their imagined futures in plausible science rather than pure adventure. Among the writers who emerged from that era were Isaac Asimov, a biochemist by academic training, who in his stories developed the famous three laws of robotics and imagined vast, calculating psychohistory that could predict the broad sweep of future civilizations from statistical patterns in human behavior. His own fictional echo, in a way, of the Delphi method's faith in aggregated reasoning. There was also Arthur C. Clarke, who in 1945, while still working for Britain's Royal Air Force, published a technical paper proposing that satellites placed in a particular orbit, now called geostationary orbit, could be used to relay radio and television communications around the entire globe, an idea considered visionary at the time and one that became a literal, physical reality. With the launch of communication satellites just under 2 decades later, Clarke did not merely imagine the future loosely, he calculated it. And then, on the 4th of October in 1957, the future stopped being merely imagined and became, quite suddenly, a matter of national urgency. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth, a metal sphere no larger than a beach ball, silently circling the planet and transmitting a simple radio beep that could be picked up by amateur radio operators around the world. The effect on the American public was immediate and profound. A wave of anxiety about falling behind in science and technology that historians now call the Sputnik crisis. It reshaped American education policy, poured new funding into science and engineering programs, and led directly, within less than a year, to the founding of NASA in 1958. 4 years later, in 1961, President John F. Kennedy stood before a joint session of the United States Congress and made a promise that at the time sounded almost recklessly bold, that the United States would land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth before the decade was out. It's worth remembering just how uncertain that promise really was when Kennedy made it. America had at that point sent only one astronaut, Alan Shepard, on a brief suborbital flight lasting a matter of minutes. The technology to actually reach the moon didn't yet fully exist. And yet, 8 years later, on the 20th of July in 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped down onto the surface of the moon and spoke words that had, in fact, been prepared and considered carefully in advance. Though he later admitted he stumbled slightly in the delivery. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Hundreds of millions of people around the world watched it happen, live, on television screens, many of them in their own homes at night, not unlike the way you might be listening to this right now. Behind that single famous moment stood an enormous, largely uncelebrated effort of prediction and planning. At its peak, the Apollo program employed several 100,000 people across NASA and its network of contractors and universities. And much of that effort was, in its essence, an exercise in forecasting, trying to anticipate every conceivable failure before it happened, running simulation after simulation of situations that had never actually occurred. It didn't always work. In January of 1967, a cabin fire during a launchpad test killed astronauts Virgil, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, a tragedy that forced NASA to redesign much of the spacecraft's systems and safety procedures before any crewed mission could fly again. And in April of 1970, an oxygen tank explosion aboard Apollo 13 turned a routine lunar mission into a desperate, several-day struggle simply to bring the astronauts home alive. A crisis resolved only through exactly the kind of rapid, careful scenario thinking that Herman Kahn and his colleagues at RAND had spent the previous decade trying to formalize. It's worth remembering this alongside the triumph of the moon landing itself, that the history of imagining the future has never really been a story of clean, unbroken foresight. It has always included these near misses, these corrections, these hard lessons paid for in real consequences. Space had entered the human imagination as a destination for the future. But almost simultaneously, in ordinary offices and universities, a much quieter revolution was beginning, one that would, in time, turn out to matter even more. In December of 1968, at a computer conference in San Francisco, an engineer named Douglas Engelbart, working at the Stanford Research Institute, gave a 90-minute live demonstration that would later become known, almost reverently, as the mother of all demos. In front of a stunned audience, Engelbart demonstrated, for what was likely the first time anywhere. A working computer mouse, on-screen windows, hypertext links, and real-time collaborative editing of documents between two people in different locations. A set of ideas so far ahead of the computing norms of 1968 that it would take roughly 2 more decades for most of them to become commonplace. Less than a year later, in October of 1969, researchers successfully sent the first message across a new experimental computer network called ARPANET, funded by the United States Department of Defense, the direct ancestor of what we now simply call the Internet. The engineers involved later recalled with a certain wry humor that the very first message, meant to be the word login, actually crashed the system after only the letters L and O had been transmitted. These two threads, space and computing, represented two very different visions of the future, competing for the culture's attention throughout the 1960s and 70s. And around the same time, a different, more skeptical mood was beginning to spread as well. In 1970, an American writer and futurist named Alvin Toffler published a book called Future Shock, co-developed extensively with his wife and longtime collaborator, Adelaide Heady Toffler, though her contributions were, for many years, undercredited on the book's cover in a manner that reflected the era's broader habits around crediting women's intellectual work. The book's central argument was that the sheer accelerating pace of technological and social change was beginning to outstrip the human nervous system's capacity to adapt, leaving people disoriented, anxious, unmoored, a condition the Tofflers termed future shock. The book became an enormous bestseller and helped popularize the entire idea of professional futurism as a field unto itself. Toffler had spent years as a journalist, including a stint at Fortune magazine, and much of his early research for Future Shock grew out of interviews he conducted with ordinary workers, engineers, and scientists across the country, listening carefully to how they described their own sense of disorientation amid rapid change, rather than deriving his theory purely from abstract reasoning. That grounding in real, lived testimony is likely part of why the book resonated so widely. It wasn't only a set of predictions about gadgets, but a description of an emotional condition that a great many readers immediately recognized in themselves. That same broad cultural moment also produced Stuart Brand's Whole Earth catalog, first published in 1968, a strange and influential publication that blended countercultural values with an early, genuine enthusiasm for technology as a tool of personal empowerment rather than corporate or military control, a philosophy that would, decades later, be cited by figures like Steve Jobs as a formative influence on the culture of Silicon Valley. Brand himself had an unusually wide-ranging background even for this story. He had trained as a biologist, briefly as an Army officer, and spent time among artists and experimental thinkers on the American West Coast before turning his attention to publishing. The Whole Earth catalog's back cover famously declared, in its own quiet way, that individuals now had access to enough tools and information to shape their own future directly, without waiting for large institutions to do it for them. A sentiment that, whether or not you find it entirely persuasive, captured something real about the shifting in relationship. In this particular era, between ordinary people and the technologies that had previously belonged almost exclusively to governments, universities, and large corporations. In 1972, a group called the Club of Rome published a report called The Limits to Growth, which used early computer modeling to argue that continued exponential growth in population, industrial output, and resource consumption would, on current trends, lead to serious ecological and economic crises within the following century. The report was, and remains, deeply contested among economists and scientists. Some of its specific projections did not unfold as modeled, while its broader warnings about the finite nature of resources and the dangers of unchecked growth continue to be debated in the context of modern climate science. It's a useful reminder that not every attempt to see forward succeeds, and that even careful, quantitative forecasting carries real uncertainty. That same worry about the planet's long-term trajectory only grew more organized in the decades that followed. In 1988, the United Nations and the World Meteorological Organization jointly established the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, bringing together thousands of scientists from around the world to periodically adequately review, and summarize the accumulating research on how the Earth's climate was changing and what different possible futures might look like, depending on the choices made in the present. In a sense, this represented the RAND scenario method and the Delphi method's aggregation of expert judgment applied at planetary scale. Not a single prophecy about the Earth's fate, but a careful, evolving range of possible futures, branching outward depending on what humanity chose to do next. It is, perhaps, the most consequential piece of future forecasting ever attempted, precisely because, unlike so many of the predictions we've walked through tonight, it was explicitly designed to change the very outcome it was describing. Chain reactions, once started, rarely stay contained to a single field. The digital revolution that Engelbart had glimpsed in 1968 kept accelerating through the 70s and 80s. Personal computers arriving in ordinary homes. For the first time, companies like Apple and IBM racing to define what a computer sitting on someone's desk could actually be for. And out of that accelerating, slightly disorienting moment came a new flavor of science fiction, one that captured the mood of the era with startling precision. In 1984, a writer named William Gibson published a novel called Neuromancer, coining the term cyberspace to describe a vast, shared digital realm that people could enter and navigate, a term that, within just a few years, would become part of everyday language, used to describe the very real network, then quietly expanding beneath the surface of ordinary life. Gibson later said, with some amusement, that he wrote much of the novel on a manual typewriter, having barely used a computer himself at the time, imagining, with unusual accuracy, a technological world he had almost no direct experience of. He has since described the germ of the idea coming to him while watching young people playing early video games in arcades, noticing how completely absorbed they became, leaning into the machines as if their bodies wanted to follow their attention straight through the screen. A small, ordinary observation that he then extended, carefully and imaginatively, into an entire imagined geography of computer networks. Neuromancer went on to win the Hugo, Nebula, and Philip K. Dick Awards, an unusual sweep of science fiction's major honors that reflected just how sharply it seemed to capture something true about where computing culture was heading, even from a writer working, by his own admission, largely by instinct rather than technical expertise. That network broke fully into public life in the early 1990s. In 1989, a British computer scientist named Tim Berners-Lee, working at CERN, the Large Particle Physics Laboratory in Switzerland, proposed a new system for linking and sharing documents across the existing internet, what he called the World Wide Web. By 1991, the first website was live, and by the middle of the decade, the web had begun its extraordinary spread into homes, schools, libraries, and offices around the world, transforming, in the span of less than 10 years, almost every aspect of how people communicated, worked, shopped, and learned. That extraordinary spread brought with it a fresh wave of confident predictions about the future, not all of which held up well under the weight of time. Throughout the second half of the 1990s, enormous sums of money poured into new internet-based companies, many of them built on genuinely bold, forward-looking ideas about how commerce and communication would change, and many of them, in hindsight, built on very little besides that same old, ancient human enthusiasm for imagining a dazzling tomorrow. When that bubble burst in the early 2000s, a great many companies that had promised to define the future simply vanished within months. A sharp reminder that confidence about the direction of change is not at all the same thing as confidence about its timing, or about which particular ventures would actually survive to see it. And yet, looking back from tonight, it's striking how many of the underlying ideas from that feverish period, buying goods online, banking without visiting a branch, reading news the moment it happened rather than the next morning, did eventually become simply the ordinary texture of daily life, arriving a little later and through different companies than most of the earliest predictions had assumed. And it was in this atmosphere, this feeling that computing power itself seemed to be accelerating without any obvious ceiling, that a new and even more ambitious idea about the future began to take shape. In 1993, a mathematician and science fiction writer named Vernor Vinge delivered an essay called The Coming Technological Singularity, in which he argued that the ongoing acceleration of computing capability might, within a matter of decades, produce artificial intelligence that could improve itself faster than humans could understand or control. A moment beyond which, Vinge argued, prediction itself would become essentially impossible, since the future would then be shaped by minds greater than our own. He borrowed the term singularity from physics, where it describes a point, like the center of a black hole, at which our existing models simply break down. Vinge himself had spent years teaching mathematics and computer science at San Diego State University, alongside writing science fiction novels, and he later reflected that the idea had been forming in his thinking for some time before he finally articulated it clearly in that 1993 essay delivered originally at a symposium organized by NASA. It's a fitting detail, in a way, an idea about the ultimate unpredictability of the future, first spoken aloud at an agency built, from its very founding after Sputnik, around the disciplined, careful business of trying to predict and plan for exactly what technology might make possible next. The dream of thinking machines, of course, was older than Vinge's essay by decades. In 1950, the British mathematician Alan Turing, who had already played an instrumental, and for many years officially secret, role in breaking German military codes during the Second World War, published a paper proposing what became known as the Turing test, a thought experiment suggesting that if a machine's conversation became indistinguishable from a human's in a text-based exchange, it might reasonably be considered capable of something like thinking. 6 years later, in the summer of 1956, a small group of researchers gathered at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire for what they called the Dartmouth Summer Research Project on Artificial Intelligence, a workshop widely regarded as the formal founding moment of artificial intelligence as an academic field, and the occasion on which the term artificial intelligence itself was coined, largely by the computer scientist John McCarthy. The researchers gathered there were, by most later accounts, remarkably optimistic about how quickly machines might match human reasoning. Optimism that, over the following decades, repeatedly outpaced what the technology of the time could actually deliver, leading to periods later nicknamed AI winters, when funding and enthusiasm for the field cooled considerably. It's a useful reminder, again, of how uneven this whole long history has been. Genuine breakthroughs arriving beside long stretches of disappointment, often within the same research programs. That ideas of self-improving machines was picked up and expanded over the following years by the inventor and computer scientist Ray Kurzweil, who published The Age of Spiritual Machines in 1999, and, more comprehensively, The Singularity is Near in 2005. Kurzweil argued, drawing on long historical trends in computing power, that technological change was not simply steady, but exponential, and that this exponential curve would eventually lead to artificial intelligence surpassing human intelligence and to profound changes in human biology and lifespan as well. It's worth being careful here, the way any honest historian of the future has to be careful. Kurzweil's specific timelines have been the subject of significant debate among scientists and technologists, and many of his more precise predicted dates remain unresolved or contested even now. What matters for our purposes tonight isn't whether any single forecast was exactly right. What matters is the pattern, that same old human impulse, the one that sent people climbing a mountain in ancient Greece to sit before a woman breathing strange vapors, now expressing itself through computer models and technology roadmaps and academic essays about self-improving machines. Which brings the long chain, at last, close to where you are lying right now. Because here is the quiet truth underneath everything we've just walked through. Every single generation, standing at its own particular edge of the unknown, has reached for the best tools it had. Mysticism, mathematics, engineering, computation, to answer the same old, deeply human question. What is coming, and will we be all right when it arrives? The Pythia had her vapors. Condorcet had his careful Enlightenment reasoning, scratched out while hiding from a mob. Verne had his cannons and submarines grounded in real engineering. Wells had his evolutionary anxieties. Rand had its scenarios and its Delphi panels. The World's Fair had its miniature highways. And we tonight have satellites relaying signals overhead as you sleep. Computer models running quietly in vast data centers. Artificial intelligence. Systems being trained on unimaginable oceans of human writing. All of it aimed, in its own imperfect way, at the same ancient target, trying to see just a little further down the road than the person standing next to us. None of these people across nearly 3,000 years of trying, ever really succeeded in seeing the future clearly, in fine detail. What they did instead, again and again, was something quieter and perhaps more valuable. They paid extremely close attention to the present, to the trends actually unfolding around them, to the technologies actually emerging, to the fears and hopes actually alive in their own particular moment. And they extended those observations forward, carefully, with humility, with qualifying language, the good ones always adding some version of likely, or perhaps, or if current trends continue. The future, it turns out, was never really a place you could visit. It was always just the present, examined honestly enough, and followed a little further than everyone else was willing to follow it. Think, too, about how often the people in this story were wrong in exactly the same kind of way. Watkins was superb at extending communication technology and hopeless at predicting language reform. The Club of Rome captured a real and important dynamic about finite resources while getting many of its specific timelines and outcomes wrong. Kurzweil's broad instinct about accelerating computation has largely held up, even as many of his precise dates have come and gone without the events he attached to them. Across nearly 3 centuries, the pattern repeats. Humans have consistently been better at seeing the shape of change than at pinning down exactly when it would arrive, or exactly which small detail would turn out to matter most. Perhaps that shouldn't be surprising. The future isn't a fixed destination waiting patiently to be discovered. It's closer to a wide river, with countless small tributaries, most of them invisible until the moment they join the main current. And no one, however careful, has ever been able to see all of them at once. And that, in its own way, is a strangely comforting thought to end on, here in the dark, because it means the future isn't something arriving from far away, out of some unreachable distance, to happen to you. It's being built, quietly, in ordinary moments like this one, in laboratories, in notebooks, in conversations, in the small accumulating choices of billions of ordinary people going about their ordinary days. And it also means that you, lying here right now, in this room, in this particular moment of one particular night, are not really separate from that long chain of people straining to see forward. You're simply the place the chain has reached so far. Tomorrow, whatever it holds, will be built the same way all the tomorrows before it were built. Slowly, imperfectly, mostly by people who never knew, at the time, which of their careful guesses would turn out to matter. The room is quiet now. The devices on the nightstand have gone still, their small lights dimmed, their long, invisible threads of connection reaching out into satellites and cables and data centers you will never see, doing their patient work without needing you awake for any of it. There is nothing left to figure out tonight. No prediction to make, no forecast to check, no chain of discovery left to follow. All of that long chain, the oracle, the mathematician in hiding, the engineer with his cannon aimed at the moon, the men with their scenarios and their satellites, all of it can rest now too, folded quietly away, the way a book closes at the end of a long chapter. Just the weight of the blanket, settling a little more with every breath, just the softness under your head holding you the way it has held you every other night. Your breath is slower now than it was when we began, slower than it was an hour ago. There is nowhere else to be. There is nothing else to know. The body knows how to do this part without any help at all. It has been doing it for as long as there have been bodies, long before anyone thought to wonder what tomorrow might hold. The dark is soft. The pillow is warm where your head has settled into it. Somewhere far outside this room, machines are still quietly listening to the sky, still quietly counting, still quietly guessing, and none of it needs you anymore tonight. Just this breath, and this one, and the quiet after it.